I've mentioned it a few times on the channel now, but I'm really into fantasy. While there are a lot of different franchises that are responsible for fostering that interest in the genre, the main one, as you could guess, is the grandfather of them all, Lord of the Rings. Tolkien's work and its various adaptations and interpretations have played an important role in shaping my love of fantasy. The Rankin Bass and Ralph Bakshi films are a nostalgic part of my childhood. The Peter Jackson films hold a special place in my heart, even the ones that are objectively bad. And Shadow of War is straight up one of my favorite video games of all time, and something I will make a video essay on at some point. As I've gotten older and gotten more into exploring more aspects of Tolkien's world, like the Tolkien letters and the Silmarillion, reading and listening through those has been very informative about the deep lore aspects of the Legendarium. So I think it might surprise people that I actually like Rings of Power, especially now that the second season has wrapped up and remedied a lot of issues that I had with the first one. Rings of Power is a divisive show, a battleground between Tolkien purists, casual fans, fantasy nerds like me, and those weirdos who complain about the diversity in the casting. I'm not going to be talking about fan reception in this video like how I did in The Acolyte, especially since so much of it is the typical nerd stance of, "It's not accurate to the source material," that I've grown more and more to dislike because of how rarely it's any deeper than that. But it is worth talking about some of it because a lot of the improvements are based on how the show has changed. Kind of like with The Acolyte, I thought the first season had a lot of promise despite its flaws, but unlike The Acolyte, Rings of Power was actually able to iron out most of them and has become much better for it. I think it's gone from being a fine interpretation of disparate elements of the Legendarium to a good adaptation in its own right, and that's thanks to the lessons learned from the first season. So in today's video, acting as filler before the October video I was going to make spiraled out of my control, we're going to talk about Rings of Power, the issues I had with the first season, and what the second season did to improve the show overall. Also, as you might guess, there's gonna be spoilers, so be warned. Season 1 of Rings of Power is set during the end of the Second Age of Middle-earth, and is largely focused on original content despite having some basis on events in the Legendarium. The show follows a large cast of protagonists from various backgrounds. The struggle between the inhabitants of the Southlands against the invading forces of Adar, father of the Orcs, the Harfoot's nomadic lifestyle being interrupted by the arrival of definitely not Gandalf and his misadventures with Nori and her friend Poppy, the rising conflict between those loyal to the ways of the elves like Queen Regent Miriel and Elendil, and the rising darker element within Numenor embodied by Ar-Pharazon and his rat bastard son, and Elrond and Durin's strained friendship as the kingdom of Khazad-dûm begins to walk the path that will lead to it becoming a ruined wasteland. Where the first season really shines is in offering its own explanations to certain events, exploring Tolkien tropes in new ways, fleshing out lore characters and making them appealing, and the new content created specifically for the show. I think it's really heartwarming to think that Gandalf's long-standing affection for hobbits and their culture is because they cared for him when he first arrived in Middle-earth. I think Elrond and Durin's friendship brings a fresh angle to the idea of elves and dwarves overcoming their culture's biases and becoming friends, by doing what Free Rent Beyond Journey's End does, and exploring how being a friend with a practically immortal person affects your relationship with them.
I journeyed here to see my friend whom I've greatly missed.
Missed? You missed my wedding, the birth of my children, 2 of them. 20 years may be the blink of an eye to you now, but I've lived an entire life in that time, a life you missed.
I've never really thought too much about lore characters like Elendil and Isildur, but I think the show makes them compelling, with Isildur being a man of elvish virtue in a changing Numenor, and Isildur's search for a purpose in life being what will lead him to Middle-earth. And I think Ar-Pharazon is straight up great, starting off as a man of the people who we will see has much more sinister intentions, and I cannot wait to see him fall under Sauron's influence and declare war on heaven. I think Adar and his orcs are straight up the most interesting characters in the show, and I think their struggle to find a place to belong in a world where everyone equally hates them and wants to wipe them out is far more compelling than the boring Southland humans who get displaced by them.
Stop fucking crying, bitch! Where? I don't wanna fucking hear.
A lot of new elements the show creates feel like they're something Tolkien would arguably approve of. like the Dwarven stone singers being reminiscent of how Middle-earth was sung into existence by the Valar, Mithril being tied to the Silmarils in terms of importance and the apocryphal legend described by Elrond, or the MacGuffin keysword being a dark artifact that feeds on its host, being very in line with the corrupting evil of Morgoth and his followers. I'm probably the only guy that likes the overall production value of the show, like the armor or the creatures, or the show's takes on various locations in the Legendarium that we've never seen before put to screen, like Valinor and Numenor. I especially love the Byzantine-esque look of Numenor, and I think it's very reminiscent of Weta Workshop's goal in the Lord of the Rings films to depict various cultures as if they were missing links from our own history.
While we didn't want to make it obvious, like you go, oh look, the elves are Greek, or the dwarves are this or that, we didn't want to make it obvious like that because that's not what we're doing. What we wanted to create were alternative cultures that look like they could come straight out of history, but you're never quite sure where they're from.
I also think there's a lot of really good music in the first season. Bear McCreary is no Howard Shore, but he's still able to write a lot of good music for the show, as you would expect from the composer of the new God of War games. However, I think the big thing that lets down the first season is the main story, which all of the smaller stories weave in and out of. The main focus of Season 1 is Galadriel, and her quest to avenge her dead brother Finrod, who died at the hands of Sauron, and the ways that her desire for revenge will push world events forward. My nuclear hot take about Galadriel is that she's the most complex and interesting character in the show, but the reason why she kinda sucks is because the story doesn't really do a good job of hooking in the audience into liking her compared to the other protagonists. During my first watch through of the season, I mainly sided in the middle of Galadriel discourse, where I thought that she was cool but really let down by the writing. It also didn't help that I was also watching Better Call Saul for the first time, and Kim Wexler was proving to be a much better written female character. But rewatching the first season now, I think that it's a really good storytelling choice to have her be so blinded by her desire for revenge that it leaves her incredibly open to being manipulated by Sauron. With the season fully out and the whole stupid "who is Sauron" mystery not a factor anymore, I think it's really fun to watch Sauron not really try to hide who he is, but Galadriel not really seeing this because she only sees what she needs him to be. That he really is the lost heir to an ancient bloodline who can help her win over Numenor and help her defeat the Sauron-y guy who pops up around the same time that the light of the elves begins to fade in Middle-earth. So many of Halbrand's lines have this double meaning in the first season that really stand out after it's revealed that he's just a guise used by Sauron.
That's funny. I found this on a dead man.
The last man to bear your crest died over 1,000 years ago.
I told you I found this on a dead man.
Part of why Galadriel is a hard character to like is that most of her development comes late in the show, and a lot of people wrote her off long before then. I really like that part of Galadriel's obsession with killing Sauron comes from the fact that she's been fighting for so long against his and Morgoth's evil that she doesn't really know how to live otherwise. But this is something that I feel like the show should have conveyed earlier. Comparatively, Elrond is a character who is much easier to understand and sympathize with, and his failure to help stop his people's light from fading is much more engaging than Galadriel's revenge quest. A personal problem that I had with the first season of Rings of Power in spite of liking them was Adar and his orcs. For the sake of transparency, orcs would probably be my favorite fantasy race if dwarves and dragons didn't exist. I absolutely love Tolkien orcs, especially the way that they're depicted in the Jackson films, and Lurtz and Gothmog are among some of my favorite glup shittos in the Legendarium. Something that I really appreciate about revisiting the show is now a lot more of the nuances of the show with Sauron and Galadriel stand out with their connections to Adar and the orcs, even if I think their presence in the show is overall mixed. Knowing that Halbrand is Sauron makes his hatred of him stand out more, because his most worthless servants are the ones that overthrew him. Galadriel's racist tirade that she gives when Adar is captured makes a lot more sense because she has peak Sauron brain rot at this point, even if I still think that it's wild that they had her do this without her being challenged that much. Adar is probably my favorite original character in the show, because unlike the ones that coast off of the rule of cool like Arondir, or the lovably one-note Waldreg, he really stands out with how he's written. Him being a Moriondor is an interesting way to explore the nebulous origins of the orcs in the First Age, and I like that he still holds elvish beliefs like planting Alfrin seeds before battle,
New life in defiance of death.
or still speaking elvish. The orcs follow him out of loyalty and not out of fear, reminiscent of the relationship between Saruman and the Uruk-hai in the books, and how it's different from the way that Sauron treats orcs as a whole. I also like how the show explores the culture of the orcs in a similar way to the Jackson films, but in a way that fleshes it out.
In film 1 and film 2, we played them as much more of a sort of a rabble, this sort of schoolyard bully, the rats of the battlefield. They have clad themselves in armour that they've scrounged and picked up off the corpses of their enemies and patched these together with bits of fabric and finery, but it's all rotted away and dirtied down.
I like that the show considers that orcs are weak to sunlight and have them wear heavy cloaks when they move about during the day, or conducting raids by tunneling under places and attacking that way. I like that in the First Age flashbacks they're very militant and organized, but around the time the show takes place, their looks are very mishmash thanks to the wide range of armors taken or made from people or animals they've killed. Maggoth's funeral and distribution of his armor among the other orcs feels like a legitimate tradition from a group that we rarely see more nuance from. It comes together to characterize the orcs as this nomadic culture that has to survive off the debris of other groups because they aren't able to put down roots anywhere. But the double-edged sword of the orcs in this show also means that most of their time in the show is dedicated to typical Tolkien orc shenanigans, which are honestly done well. They're arguably done better than the more nuanced stuff with them. The show really captures the casual and often senseless cruelty of the orcs very well, like Maggoth pretending to be impressed by Arondir's friends refusing to cut down a tree and offering them water, only to use it as an opportunity to kill one of them in order to force them to do it anyway, or how they'll just kill livestock and leave them to rot when they could be used as food, or how when Waldreg and a small group of humans pledge themselves to Adar, most of them are sent in the first wave of orcs to attack the Southlanders, where they'll be the most likely to die. Despite loving the nuance that the show brings to the orcs, the imbalance between that and typical orc hijinks makes me wonder why you'd bother including it besides foreshadowing that Adar isn't Sauron. Something that I like about the conflict between the Southlands and Adar's children is that it's a battle between the two groups who suffer the most under Morgoth, but the show is a lot more willing to explore this with the human characters than it is with the orcs. But at this point, I think you get the idea that while there's a ton of stuff I liked in the first season, I still had my issues with it. Overall, I think it's a very mixed bag that works much better watching it all the way through now instead of watching it weekly. But on that note, it's time to move on to discussing Season 2. What makes Season 2 of Rings of Power so good is that the writing as a whole has hit its stride and no longer feels like it's being held back by what the Tolkien estate was willing to let the creators adapt. It also helps that much more of what happens in Season 2 is less focused on original content and is more focused on continuing to adapt parts of the Silmarillion. The overarching plot of Sauron and Celebrimbor forging the Rings of Power is adapted from that part of the Silmarillion, Numenor's overarching plot is adapted from its downfall, and there are various other aspects of the Legendarium adapted this season, most notably Tom Bombadil, but these tend to be more nods to various groups, such as Shelob and her brood, the Ents and the Entwives, the Barrow-wights, and even the Nameless Things are here.
What was that?
There are nameless things in the deep places of this world. This one we shall call supper.
Obviously, a lot of aspects from the Silmarillion are changed in adaptation, but considering that the source material was published after Tolkien's death by his son Christopher, compiling what he had written and adding to it himself, I think it's fair to say that Rings of Power diverting from it isn't the biggest sin, especially not anymore. What makes Season 2 much better is that since the show was given the chance to learn from its mistakes, take notes, Disney! It's able to become much better for it. Part of this is because a lot of the characters that were the source of ire from people reacting to the first season have much more developed arcs. In addition to this, the show changed a lot of superficial aspects that people complained about as well. Dwarf women now have facial hair, and elven men can now have long hair. Even Elrond's growing his hair out. I'm so proud of him. Galadriel is probably the one who has most notably improved as a character. After the eruption of Mount Doom halfway through the last season, she began to let go of much of her anger, especially after discovering that it allowed her to be manipulated by Sauron. This is most notably symbolized by her surrendering Finrod's dagger so it could be used in the creation of the Elven Rings of Power. Galadriel's arc this season is about her continued growth, because while she is a much less angry character, she is still driven to defeat Sauron. not out of revenge, but in order to prove that she is still capable of stopping him. But while Galadriel is still growing, the show is still aware of her pitfalls from the last season, which have huge ramifications in this one. The show changing the way the Elven Rings were created means that Sauron was present long enough that when Elrond discovers the line of lineage Galadriel found that proves that Halbrand was Sauron, it makes him mistrust the rings. Galadriel eventually admits that Sauron was there, causing a rift to form between her and Elrond. But meanwhile, Celebrimbor is never told why Halbrand cannot be allowed back into Eregion, and this ends disastrously. Even though the rings are free from Sauron's influence, showcased by them being able to heal the Great Tree of Lindon, which in Season 1 acted as a representation of the time the elves had left in Middle-earth, Elrond doesn't trust them, and will have to learn to put his faith in them and Galadriel again over the course of the season. Also, I understand that Elrond and Galadriel's kiss was only done so he could distract everyone from him passing her a lockpick, but I just think it's really funny that apparently it's human nature to ship Galadriel with literally anyone other than her canonical husband.
Hey, you! Back away from my wife!
In my opinion, Celebrimbor and Sauron are the standout characters in this season. One of the most bizarre complaints about the first season was about Celebrimbor. Specifically in the general whinging about the elves, he was negatively compared to the version of Celebrimbor featured in Monolith's Middle-earth games. I have to preface this by saying that I fucking love Celebrimbor in Shadow of War, and who wouldn't? He's voiced by Alistair Duncan, the guy who voiced Senator Armstrong. It's practically impossible to compete with that.
You will serve the Bright Lord!
But it's funny that a version of him that heavily diverges from the source material was favored by fans in comparison to the more accurate version of him. I also think that a problem with the Sauron mystery in Season 1 is that he spends so much time as Halbrand that we don't really get to experience his evil directly until the final episode. With Sauron revealed and a far more active character in this season, it adds a lot to the story, especially now because we get to follow him out in the open. Having the first episode focus on how he ended up as Halbrand on that boat in the first season was a really good choice. I like how this form of him is very similar to fan depictions of him in the First Age. I like that despite his claims that he'll be better than Morgoth throughout this season, he still reforges his crown to wear. And his survival of Adar's attempt to kill him is really unnerving and effectively showcases that it's impossible to kill him at this time. You can only destroy whatever face he takes. This season really captures the monstrosity of Sauron very well, and you could absolutely understand why he'd refuse to take that boat guy's advice on changing for the better and ultimately reject any form of redemption. And that plays into what makes him an effective villain. The reason why Sauron is held up as a great villain, despite him rarely being featured in Lord of the Rings, is by his effect on the world and its inhabitants. His most ardent followers are people who have been corrupted or deceived into following his will. And the ring directly corrupts and influences characters that we've come to love, so we're invested in their struggles against its influence. In Season 1, Celebrimbor is shown to live in the shadow of his ancestor Feanor, the creator of the Silmarils, and his desire to create something notable of his own is fulfilled when the Elven Rings turn out to be the work key to extending the stay of the elves in Middle-earth. I love how Feanor's hammer is a recurring item in the show, and these two seasons really make it stand out just as much as something like Narsil. But this insecurity is something Sauron is able to capitalize on, especially because Galadriel never told Celebrimbor why he couldn't interact with Halbrand, causing Sauron to take his most infamous form in order to deceive the Master Smith.
A sharer of gifts, Annatar.
What makes the dichotomy between Celebrimbor and Annatar stand out is that it starts off with a seemingly genuine friendship that Sauron uses in order to manipulate Celebrimbor into creating more rings, supposedly so that all of Middle-earth can share in the power that characters like Gil-galad believe only deserve to be wielded by the elves. What makes Sauron's lies especially effective is that they're sprinkled with enough truth to make them believable. Yeah, it is stupid that only the elves get to have the rings, especially since a lot of the reasons given for why others shouldn't get them are rooted in elven prejudice.
We cannot give rings to men. The risk of corruption is simply too great. Whatever problems we might solve would be nothing against those we could create.
Yes, men are capable of great frailty, but when the darkness falls, there are always some who rise forth and shine. Eärendil, Tur, Beren, son of Barahir.
Something I like in the presentation of Annatar is that when he's initially introduced, he's depicted very similarly to fan interpretations of him. But as the season progresses, his costumes become darker and darker until Annatar is effectively his own Dark Lord. And this coincides with his relationship with Celebrimbor becoming far more manipulative and his control over Eregion becoming more absolute. I like that his relationship with Mardania is effectively a microcosm of his relationship with Celebrimbor, with it being just as manipulative and his seeming affection for her ending with her being a pawn in his greater schemes. Celebrimbor is a much more engaging and ultimately tragic character this season, as his relationship with Annatar begins to deteriorate and he begins to question the identity of his former friend. The creation of the other rings leads him down a dark path, thanks to Annatar's nudging, making him burn a lot of bridges until he's in far too deep. Sauron has convinced most of Eregion that Celebrimbor has gone mad and continues to pressure him to continue his work. Celebrimbor standing up to Sauron as much as he can is really effective, especially as things grow more desperate as the sacking of Eregion begins. Celebrimbor cutting off his thumb in order to escape was really unexpected, and I really enjoyed it because of how well it was executed. His speech to Galadriel when he gives her the 9 about how light and not strength will overcome darkness, his failed attempts to stop Sauron, and his prophecy of how the creation of the rings will lead to the Dark Lord's undoing before his death were all done very effectively.
Shadow of Morgoth, hear the dying words of Celebrimbor. The rings of power shall destroy you, and in the end, I foresee, one alone shall prove your utter ruin!
You are wrong. I am their creator. I am their master.
No, you are their prisoner. Sauron, Lord of the Rings.
It was perfect. Perfect. Everything, down to the last minute details.
Charles Edwards' performance as Celebrimbor was beautifully complemented by Charlie Vickers as Sauron. And hey, if you still hated Celebrimbor even after this season, Sauron goes on to use his corpse as a banner for his army, so you have that to look forward to next season. The other characters' stories from the previous season are continued in interesting ways, though I don't think some are as engaging as they were previously. One of the ones that I think is handled better is how Numenor's story is continued. Numenor's role in the plot is split, following Elendil and those faithful to the ways of the elves on the island, while Isildur is trapped on Middle-earth after his apparent death in the last season. Numenor is deeply divided between people who still follow the old ways and a growing anti-elvish sentiment. And while at times this feels like modern politics to a painfully stupid degree,
Elf workers, taking your trades!
Are we cringing yet?
It has a lot more similarities with similar cycles of faith and doubt in the Bible. Ar-Pharazon starts out as a champion of the people, but as time passes, we see that this is a stepping stone into him seizing political power, something that becomes much easier because of Galadriel convincing Miriel to travel to Middle-earth, ends in disaster, and with her being blinded. Pharazon's son Kemen and Elendil's daughter Eärien are the main enforcers of his will this season, as he begins to fall under the influence of the Palantir like how Miriel did, but to a much larger degree, with Kemen becoming a character second only to Sauron in hateability, and Eärien gradually realizing that she's fallen in with the wrong crowd and desperately trying to save her father from being purged along with the rest of the faithful. Meanwhile, Isildur is having his own adventures with the survivors of the Southlands as he tries to find a way back to Numenor. Bronwyn, Arondir's love interest from the first season, succumbed to an injury she received from Orcs, and both Arondir and her son Theo struggle to cope with her grief. Arondir believes that killing Adar will satisfy his need for revenge, while Isildur's own struggles with the belief that he was responsible for his mother's death help Theo step up and become the leader of the Southlanders in his mother's place, with Arondir and Theo resolving their issues, and Isildur being an inspiration to the boy. The show also introduces a potential love interest for Isildur in the form of Estrid, a low man, and one of a number of wild men who have grown to become a problem after the dissolution of the Southlands. Estrid's inclusion also shows more complexities to the problems that the wild men pose, as most work for Adar. While some like Waldreg willingly joined Adar and his forces, most don't necessarily have a real choice in the matter, explicitly shown in a lot of Adar-focused scenes.
In Mordor you bow, or you bleed.
Isildur and Esther's relationship is interesting, but I didn't really think that much of it. The parts of the story following Durin IV and his wife Disa follow up on his strained relationship with his father, Durin III. In the first season, his father's prejudices and hard-headed nature caused the pair to clash, first over the mining of Mithril, then in its potential use in order to save the elves. This infighting led to Durin being stripped of his title as a prince, and the rift between them seemingly becoming unfixable. However, the eruption of Mount Doom has had massive consequences for every plot. In the first season, it led to the creation of Mordor, Miriel was blinded and Isildur was believed dead, and the food sources on the Harfoot's migrations were destroyed by far-flung Pyroclast. And in this season, we see that earthquakes caused by its eruptions has caused damage to Khazad-dûm, greatly weakened stone singing, and has cut the kingdom off from the sources of light that kept its farmlands self-sufficient. A seeming answer to this problem is presented in the Dwarven Rings of Power, and they seem to work well as King Durin is quickly able to reopen the light shafts. But this power also begins to turn his head, as he holds the other rings over the heads of the other Dwarven realms in exchange for tribute, and forces his people to dig deeper into the earth. While Durin III is reinstated as a prince, he and Disa doubt the good intentions of the ring, and it's left ambiguous as to whether or not Sauron is affecting the king through it, or if this is just his worst tendencies follow to their logical conclusion. I like that when Sauron is initially refused by Durin in order to get more Mithril to forge more rings, he thinks about retaliating, but as soon as he realizes that something is gonna take Durin out for him, he just decides to leave peaceably. I love how evil this guy is. Oh yeah, the Balrog. Remember the Balrog? Even though one of the powers of the Dwarven Rings is that King Durin is able to sense all the ores and minerals hidden beneath the mountain, he's not able to detect the presence of a Balrog, something that adds to the ambiguity of whether or not the Dwarven Rings have true allegiance to darkness. Durin and Elrond's friendship was tested intensely in the first season, but when Eregion comes under siege, Durin is forced to choose his father over his friend when King Durin threatens to unleash the Balrog. While Durin III comes to his senses and rejects the ring's power, the Balrog is only trapped again with his sacrifice. But the dwarves' continued friendship with the elves becomes more uncertain and strained, with the political infighting in the wake of the king's unexpected death.
Rumours fly that you are not your father's preferred heir. Some of the other dwarf lords are advancing claims, and the brother seems to be gathering support.
The only story I think was not done as well compared to the first season is the story of Gandalf, Poppy, and Nori. I think for the most part it's interesting and well done at points. I like Poppy and Nori's misadventures with the Stoors. I think it's pretty clear that they and the Harfoots will join up and create Hobbiton together, as their traditions will combine and form Hobbit culture as a whole. And Nobody has some pretty solid jokes.
Why is it exactly they call you Nobody?
My folks aren't the most decisive. Took them a long time to settle on a name.
Well, how long?
1 or 2 years.
Oh, that's not so long.
1 or 2 years ago. And by that point, nobody'd stuck.
In the true spirit of Tolkien, Tom Bombadil is here for no reason. And I think it's really funny that after years of Tolkien fans complaining about him not being in the Jackson films, he's just in a show that's been widely panned by them. From the way Gandalf talks about Bombadil, it's clear that they've met before, and I like that the show's reason for this is that he helped Gandalf learn to master his abilities, as well as find his name and his staff. He provides a much-needed lighthearted element to a season that's far darker than the first. But I think the part that lets this section of the story down is the Dark Wizard, and the reason for that is that he embodies a lot of similarities with the Sauron mystery that weighed down the first season. On paper, I like him. I think it's interesting that he's collected this strange group of runic characters to him, and all of them feel like they could exist in a part of Middle-earth that Tolkien didn't necessarily flesh out that much. I like that he knows who Gandalf is, and was in Astaria that traveled to Middle-earth with him, but fell into darkness. And if he's not Saruman, he certainly embodies a lot of characteristics of Saruman from the books. Mainly that he believes that he's working against Sauron, when he's really becoming a darker power equal to him. But the ambiguity surrounding him is kind of frustrating, and it weighs a lot of this plot down, especially since the main arc of the show eclipses it with how it's more interesting this time around. But on that note, I think it was a good choice for the Harfoots and Gandalf to go their separate ways. And I think that it's a good note to end their travels together on as world events ramp up. And I think if they and Gandalf meet up again next season, I think the writers would have to do a lot to justify it. But I think the plot thread that really stood out to me the most was the conclusion of Adar's journey as a character, as it embodies the way that the show has changed and refused to change. Starting off with Sauron's death at the hands of Adar and the Orcs is a strong way to start the season. Not only do we get to see Sauron's lowest point, but it's pretty understandable why they turn on him when he proposes the creation of the One Ring. The First Age just ended with the Valar coming to Middle-earth to sort out Morgoth's shit, and the war was so intense that it sunk part of the continent into the sea, and Sauron's acting like it's just business as usual. With the knowledge that Sauron is the one that tortured Adar during the process of turning him into a Moriondor, there's a large amount of catharsis to him using Morgoth's crown to land the first blow on him. The show also uses the visual imagery from the Jackson films of Sauron's body rupturing upon his supposed death, turning the fortress of Fordowaith into an icy wasteland as seen in the first season. We see a lot more of Orc society in this season, and the ways that it's changed thanks to the creation of Mordor. They coexist somewhat with the wild man who pledged themselves to Adar, and a lot of them, like new character Glug, have been able to raise families thanks to the relative stability that their country provides. But the cracks begin to form when Halbrand comes to Mordor and informs Adar that Sauron is alive and working with Galadriel, with the father of the Orcs agreeing to let him go if he pledges allegiance to him and works to destroy Sauron.
I vow to serve the Lord of Mordor to the end of my days, and his.
Halbrand goes to Eregion to supposedly find Sauron, and Adar decides to muster his hosts and follow him there to kill his former master. This dark path will begin to foster a rift between Adar and his children as his need for revenge begins to eclipse his care for his children. These doubts are showcased through Glug, since as he works as Adar's advisor, he's featured heavily in the show, and questions his actions the most, though he's certainly not the only one.
Anything's better than dying to help Adar chase a ghost.
Actions like the sacking of Eregion, in spite of the fact that it would certainly leave the Orcs vulnerable to attack, or recruiting Damrod the Hill Troll in their efforts despite the fact that he has a marked distaste for Orcs. Damrod himself is a fun character, and apparently the creators were inspired by Mike from Breaking Bad of all things when creating with him. The tensions are escalated when Galadriel is captured by them when her attempt to go to Eregion to investigate Sauron's potential presence goes south, and she plants the idea that Sauron is luring Adar and his forces there to assume command. And Glug's personal breaking point comes when his father sends Damrod into the fray to breach the wall, something that will directly result in Orcish deaths. Something I appreciate is that Glug, and by extension the Orcs showcased in this season, are a lot younger and less familiar with Sauron's treatment of them. The main Orcs that we see in Season 1, Magrot, Vrath, Lorca, and Bazur among others, are older and more experienced, potentially serving as captains or officers in Morgoth's army. Because of their inexperience and growing mistrust of Adar, this leaves them open to manipulation.
Are you him? Are you Sauron?
I have many names. What is yours?
Adar plans to kill Sauron by using the power of Galadriel's ring and Morgoth's crown in order to destroy him utterly, something that becomes easier when Elrond arrives with Gil-galad and an elven host to break the siege, and unfortunately is the person Galadriel gave the ring to in order to stop this from happening. After easily bodying Arondir and Elrond, he takes the ring, but this has unforeseen consequences. Nenya specifically of the Elven Rings has been shown to heal multiple times in this season. Not just the Tree of Lindon, but physical injuries. And when Adar temporarily wears it, for a time it heals the effects of Morgoth's torture upon him, also providing him with a lot of clarity to the ways he's messed up this season. Adar promises that if Galadriel helps him, he'll recall his armies to never bother Middle-earth again, something that touches her because she finally recognizes the humanity in a character that she's despised for most of the show. Interrupting this, a group of Orcs have arrived from Eregion with news that Sauron has escaped and bring a mortally wounded Glug for Adar to perform the last rites on. But unfortunately, this turns out to be a trick, with Adar being killed the exact same way that Sauron was at the beginning of the season. Part of why the orcs in this season stood out is that while their presentation has improved, it really feels like the show only really understood the potential that Adar and his thesis on orcs presented 5 seconds before his death. And as someone who thought that it was really interesting, I'm pretty disappointed in how it was handled, even if I enjoyed it for the most part. I mentioned Breaking Bad earlier, and I think the show emulated it in a fun way with Damrod, but also emulated a recurring theme from it as well. Pointlessness. Mike's death in the show was pointless, as Walt killed him out of spite because he told him the truth about how he screwed up. And we see similar pointlessness not only with the heroes, but also with the villains. Damrod's death was pointless because he threw his life away and didn't even manage to breach the wall. Adar's death was pointless because the orcs were just manipulated into killing the only person in the Legendarium who ever cared about them. And Glug's betrayal of him in order to serve someone who he thinks will be a better master turns out to be pointless as well. Sauron's ensuing fight with Galadriel really drives this point home, where he casually changes forms in order to throw her words back in her face before stabbing her with Morgoth's crown and taking the Nine, meaning that Celebrimbor sacrificed himself so that Galadriel could escape with them for nothing. Sauron isn't omnipotent. He isn't a master schemer like she believes, but with his knowledge and deceit, he's able to make the best out of the situations that the show puts him in. He used this when he masqueraded as the King of the Southlands, he did this when he and Celebrimbor forged the Rings of Power, and he's done this now as the true Lord of Mordor.
This was your design from the beginning.
Please, you think too much of me.
Galadriel herself is barely able to escape with her ring before Sauron can take it, and when Glug informs him that thanks to the last-minute intervention of the dwarves, the eradication of all of Eregion was not complete, Sauron showcases the casual cruelty he treats all orcs with. Galadriel survives her fall, being rescued by the survivors of the sacking of Eregion, but her wound from Morgoth's crown is similar to the effects of a Morgul blade, and is only healed with the combined power of hers and Gil-galad's rings. It's here, faced with the choice of what the elves will do next, that she decides to make a change, and instead of being motivated by personal revenge, she will act as a shield against the darkness instead of a sword. Although things are grim, the season ends more hopefully than the last, with the elves coming together to reject the threat of Sauron and stand together as a beacon against the darkness.
The elves need only remember that it is not strength that overcomes darkness, but light. Armies may rise, hearts may fail, yet still light endures and is mightier than strength. For in its presence, all darkness must flee.
Overall, I think Season 2 of Rings of Power is a massive improvement over the first. When the first ended, I thought, this was fun, but I think they'd have to fix a lot in order for me to like it more. In spite of a lot of the great changes, the show still does have some rough edges. Because for every Glug giving the orcs more depth, you have Zor killing Elrond's horse like a psychopath. But in my opinion, the creators of the show learned from the pitfalls of the previous season and have created a much better show for it. Galadriel practically had to turn around from being the show's worst aspect to being its best, and that's through the power of good writing. I'm looking forward to seeing where Season 3 will take the show, because it made me invested in where it could go. I'm not thinking about how the show could be improved, because for the most part it has. And as for the stuff that I still think is not handled well, there's other media that handles it better than it ever could. I think that if this video has piqued your interest in the show, I'd recommend checking it out for yourself. I know that Season 1 still might be a bit of a rough ride, but I promise that if you stick it out, it'll be worth it. You should also absolutely check out stuff like The Silmarillion if it's your cup of tea, because it definitely added a lot to my enjoyment of my rewatch. Also, regardless of the fact that its orcs are better than the ones in Rings of Power, you should just watch Delicious in Dungeon, it's so good.
You better know what this is or else I'm gonna come find you.
But for now, that's everything I have to say about Rings of Power unless it pops up in a different video. If you enjoyed it, thank you for watching. Please consider subscribing, and I hope to see you all in the next video.